There are voices that need only a single second to sound, and the world immediately slows down. Not because they are loud, not because they are perfect, but because they touch a place very deep inside. A place where people store the things they have never spoken aloud. That voice once softened an entire decade of the 1990s, but the one who created it was never truly healed. That was the voice of Dolores O'Riordan, a piercing, soaring note, strange and unmistakable, at once like a prayer echoing through a church, and like a cry that had been held back for far too long. It did not follow any mold. It did not try to please. It emerged as instinct and remained like an indelible mark. Amid the wave of American alternative rock in the early 1990s, when the world was flooded with heavy guitars and explosive energy, a different sound rose from Ireland, a small land, far from the center of the music industry. A fragile female voice, unlike anything else, not flamboyant, not loud, just singing, as if reminding herself that she still existed. With the Cranberries, Dolores did not chase trends. They created a space of their own, a place where emotions were allowed to be fragile, where sadness needed no explanation, where listeners felt understood even if they could not name what they were feeling. Their music was gentle, but that voice was never truly at peace. It trembled with wounds, with things left unsaid, with cracks that had formed very early on. And from that very first moment, a quiet question followed Dolores O'Riordan throughout her journey. Why is it that a voice capable of healing millions always seems to rise from pain? To answer that, we must go back to before fame, before the packed stages, before music became a symbol. Back to a silent childhood in Ireland, where that voice was shaped by silence. Limerick was not a place where big dreams were born. It was a working-class city in the west of Ireland, where life moved slowly, inwardly, and everything was measured by discipline. Dolores O'Riordan grew up in a large family, where money was always carefully calculated, and emotions were rarely named. There, people learned how to stay silent before they learned how to express themselves. They learned how to endure before they ever learned to ask, why? A strict Catholic environment enveloped that childhood. The church was not only a place of prayer, it was where ways of thinking were shaped, where speech was regulated, and even where the sense of guilt was formed. Long services, the steady echo of prayers, and the solemn atmosphere created a world in which emotions had to be restrained, never allowed to cross prescribed limits. It was there that music entered Dolores's life. In the cold, quiet halls of the church, a voice did not need to be loud. It only needed to be sincere. Singing here was not meant for performance, but for pleading, for confession, for self-soothing. Dolores learned to sustain notes, to bend them gently, to stretch sounds as if clinging to something invisible, a habit that would follow her for the rest of her life. But beneath that discipline, cracks began to form early. Dolores's childhood was not gentle. There were wounds that came too soon, sensations of being violated, isolated, placed into situations that a child did not yet have the language to name. She did not know whom to tell, and she was never taught that she had the right to speak. So Dolores learned how to withdraw. At school, she was the different child, quiet, sensitive, easily hurt, more an observer than a participant. As she grew older, the distance between her and the world around her became increasingly clear. And yet, within that isolation, music became her only refuge. When she sang, Dolores did not need to explain. She did not need to justify. She did not need to hide. Music gave her a safe space, a place where emotions were allowed to exist without judgment. Each note was an exhale. Each sustained sound was a way of reminding herself that she was still alive, still capable of feeling. Perhaps that is why Dolores's voice would later always carry the shape of a prayer. Not a prayer for fame, not a plea for recognition, but a prayer to be heard, even if only once. Those early cracks did not disappear as she grew up. They simply learned how to hide more deeply. And then, when Dolores left Limerick, carrying that voice into a band searching for its identity, no one could have known that those quiet, hidden fractures were already preparing to change the fate of an entire generation of listeners. At some point, those who carry the most silence usually find a place to speak. For Dolores, that place did not arrive by plan. It came like a chance appointment with fate. Between a very young Irish girl and a local band still struggling to figure out who they were. At that time, the Cranberries were not yet the Cranberries the world would come to know. They had songs, they had instruments, they had effort. But everything felt as if it were standing inside a room without windows, enclosed, lacking light, and missing one decisive element: a voice, an audition, a meeting, and a moment later retold as if it were absurdly simple. Dolores walked in carrying a notebook, a few melodic ideas, and something very hard to name. She did not come to become a star. She came as someone who simply wanted to sing, as if, without singing, everything inside her would shatter. Then she recorded a demo, and from an ordinary demo, something suddenly shifted, not just because her voice was beautiful, but because her voice was different. Dolores pressed into notes as if touching a wound. She stretched words not in the correct way taught by schools, but in the way that felt right. At times, the sound burst out almost childlike, thin, bright, nearly playful. Yet just a beat later, it could turn into a sob. A cry hidden beneath the melody. Her ornamentation was not there to show technique. It felt more like a habit of someone long accustomed to speaking to herself in the dark. Those yodeling passages, the voice leaping upward and then falling, sounded at once like birds over the Irish sky and like a distress signal that needed no answer. What haunted people was the sense that Dolores was not just singing a song. She was singing what lay behind the song. And suddenly, the band had an identity. The guitar was no longer merely accompaniment. The drums were no longer just keeping time. Everything began to revolve around a new center. That voice, fragile yet stubborn, gentle yet restless. In an era when many bands tried to chase trends, the Cranberries did the opposite. They did not try to become heavier to fit the moment, nor did they try to become louder to draw attention. They created a space of their own, a space where listeners were allowed to be sad without shame, allowed to be soft without being seen as failures, allowed to remember what was lost through a melody beautiful enough to ache. And perhaps, from the moment Dolores joined the band, the story was no longer just about an Irish group. It began to become the story of an entire generation, those who grew up with a voice that sounded at once like a child and like a cry. The breakthrough did not arrive loudly. There was no media explosion, no declaration of a game changer, just an album that appeared, and stayed. Everybody else is doing it, so why can't we? Carried a title that sounded like a quiet question whispered by young people. If everyone else is doing it, why can't we? Yet the music inside was not loud or rebellious in the familiar sense. It was soft, it was slow, and it was sad. A sadness without drama, only endurance. At first, the album drifted by almost unnoticed. Then, song by song, it found its way into listeners' ears, from dorm rooms, night bus rides, small rooms where music was played softly, so as not to disturb one's own sadness. Linger was like that. A song about love, but not a love made whole. It was the feeling of standing on the line between staying and leaving. Dolores stretched each word as if clinging to something already known to be slipping away. No blame, no climax. Only an acceptance so painful it became gentle. And then came dreams, clearer, brighter. Yet even when singing of longing and hope, that voice still carried a thin trace of sadness, like a passing cloud across a beautiful morning. Joy was never complete. Happiness always came with a fragile premonition. That was the paradox behind their global pull. The Cranberries' music was gentle, but Dolores's voice was never truly at peace. In every song, that contrast could be heard colliding again and again. The melodies flowed smoothly, but the voice always trembled, like a calm surface concealing movement beneath. Dolores did not sing to release. She sang as if holding everything in, allowing it to escape only just enough to keep it from breaking apart. And so from Ireland, that music traveled far. Without the need to understand the lyrics, without knowing the context, till listeners everywhere recognized the feeling. Loving yet afraid, hoping yet guarded, wanting to believe, but not quite daring to. In silence, Dolores became an icon in a very different way. She did not stand on stage to preach. She did not make declarations. She did not attach labels. Yet her very presence, a small woman, a voice that did not follow convention, that did not bend itself to taste, was itself a statement. That women do not need to be loud to be strong, do not need to be sharp to be heard. That vulnerability, when spoken with honesty, carries its own weight. Dolores O'Riordan did not become a feminist icon through words. She became one by existing and by not apologizing for who she was. But when private pain began to touch millions of people, it also began to carry a different weight. A weight that gentle voice would soon no longer be able to carry alone. And very soon, gentleness would have to make way for a scream. There are moments when gentleness is no longer enough. In the mid-1990s, Ireland had not yet truly emerged from the shadow of violence and division. Bombings, civilian deaths, children who never had the chance to grow up. All of it became a cycle so familiar it was terrifying. The news scrolled across screens, numbers were read aloud, and then silence. But for Dolores, silence was no longer an option. When Zombie was born, it did not carry the shape of a hit. No love, no dreams, no space for listeners to interpret freely. The song emerged as an immediate reaction, raw, confrontational, and uninvited. This was no longer a whisper. This was a blow straight to the chest. Zombie does not tell a story in the conventional way. It repeats. It compresses. It names the absurdity of violence, the numbness of people dragged so deep into hatred that they lose the ability to feel. The zombies, not monsters, but people who have lost the capacity to see one another's pain, And more importantly, the way Dolores sang changed completely. No more soft, sustained notes. No more prayer-like ornamentation. The voice now rasped, tore, burst out like a scream held in for too long. She did not try to make it beautiful. She let it be right. Each line sounded as if it scraped the throat. Each time the word zombie rang out, it was not rounded, but heavy, hard, and painful. Listeners no longer felt held. They were confronted, pulled directly into a truth everyone wanted to avoid. The Cranberries' music at this point was no longer just a place of refuge. It became a front line. The guitars grew thicker, the drums heavier. The rhythm allowed no drifting. Everything revolved around a new center. Rage spoken through the voice of someone long accustomed to silence. With Zombie, Dolores O'Riordan did not merely change the band's image. She shattered the very image the world had assigned to her. The healing voice, from this point on, began to carry the color of conflict. People were startled, some were uncomfortable, some were afraid. But many others, for the first time, felt spoken for. Because Zombie was not meant to soothe pain. It forced pain to be faced directly, and the cost of that was clear. When you scream on behalf of millions, you begin to carry wounds that no longer belong solely to you. After Zombie, Dolores could no longer return to being only a whisper. That voice had crossed into another territory, and from that moment, fame was no longer just recognition. It became pressure, a burden, something that would begin to erode the person behind the voice. So fame did not arrive as a reward. It came like a door that had been opened and never closed. After Zombie, the world no longer saw Dolores O'Riordan as merely a different kind of voice. She became a symbol, a representative of a generation, of Ireland, of resistance, of so many things she had never consciously chosen to take on. Tour followed tour. One stage dimmed its lights, another was already waiting. The city changed names every night, but the feeling remained the same: exhaustion, tension, and being watched. The media wanted answers. The audience wanted emotion. The industry wanted the stability of a marketable image. And Dolores just wanted peace. She was not born to stand beneath harsh spotlights. She did not like long interviews, repetitive questions, or imposed interpretations of who she was. But once you become a symbol, privacy is no longer an option. It is something that gets traded away. The inner struggles once sheltered by music began to surface. Emotional disorders, violent swings between exhilaration and emptiness. Prolonged exhaustion, not only physical, but mental. There were days when Dolores stood on stage and fulfilled her role completely. And there were other days when she was simply trying not to break. The music continued. Albums were released. Shows sold out. From the outside, everything looked like an uninterrupted journey of success. But inside, the distance between the person and the symbol kept growing. People loved the voice, but few knew how to love the person behind it. Dolores began to feel trapped between two versions of herself: a sensitive, vulnerable woman, and a strong public image that was not allowed to be weak. Each time she stepped onto the stage felt like putting on a coat that was too tight. She did not hate music. She hated that music had become the only place where she was allowed to exist. And so, while the world continued to call Dolores O'Riordan an icon of the 1990s, Dolores herself found it increasingly difficult to reach herself. The old cracks did not disappear. They were simply pressed down beneath the overwhelming weight of fame. Very soon, silence would return. Not the silence of childhood, but the silence of someone struggling to keep herself from falling apart. And from there, Dolores's journey would move into another phase, one where music would no longer be enough to shield her from the fractures waiting ahead. At some point, even the closest bands need to stop. Not because the music has run out, but because the people inside are exhausted. When the Cranberries went on hiatus, the world called it rest. But for Dolores O'Riordan, it was a far heavier pause. There was no longer a relentless touring schedule, no longer the pressure to represent something larger than herself. But there was also no longer the shield called a band. She tried to walk on her own. Solo projects emerged, carrying a distinct, more direct and personal tone. The music no longer aimed for crowds. It felt more like letters written to herself, careful, tentative, full of empty spaces. Dolores sang less, slower, as if each note had to be weighed to see whether it could bear any more emotion. Away from the stage, her private life also began to fracture. A marriage ended. Her family was no longer the solid refuge it once had been. One change followed another, pulling with it a sense of disorientation. Dolores moved through relationships, living spaces, roles, without any of them truly giving her the feeling of being able to stay. The media had little patience for fragility. They called it erratic, unpredictable, unstable. Few asked what lay behind those headlines. Few saw a woman trying to survive amid internal swings she herself did not fully understand. Absences, off-key statements, long stretches of silence, all of it was gathered into a simple, easily told image. But the truth was far more complex. Dolores never stopped trying. She went to therapy, she wrote, she sang. There were days when music still saved her. There were other days when it was only enough to keep everything from collapsing entirely. The voice was still there, still beautiful, still unique, but no longer light. Listeners began to notice something very small, yet very real. In those rare appearances, Dolores's voice carried fatigue. Not the fatigue of age, but the fatigue of having lived too long in a state of self-control. Each time she sang was an effort to maintain balance between memory and the present, between the desire for peace and the responsibility to continue. The music still sounded, but it could no longer hide the cracks. And in that prolonged pause, what Dolores needed most was not the public's curiosity, but a place safe enough to be weak. A place that did not require her to be a symbol, only to be herself. But sometimes, even silence is not enough to heal. And then, just as the world began to think the story had settled, another shock was quietly waiting ahead, ready to close the journey of a voice in a way no one ever wanted. That morning in 2018 arrived utterly ordinary. The news appeared quietly, then spread like a wave no one was prepared for. Dolores O'Riordan was gone. No stage, no farewell. Only a sudden emptiness where a voice had once been. For fans around the world, it was not just the shock of losing an artist. It felt like losing a part of their own memory. The songs that had accompanied their youth, through first loves, long nights, years of being lost, suddenly fell silent in a very different way. The music world responded with stillness. There was no need for long tributes, just short words, heavy and true, from artists who had stood in the same generation, from younger musicians who had grown up on her music, and from listeners who had never met Dolores in person, yet felt as though they had just lost someone deeply familiar. With the Cranberries, Dolores left behind more than albums or hit songs. She left something far harder to measure: the feeling of being heard. In a noisy world, where people are often taught to be strong, to be fine, to keep going, Dolores's voice allowed others to be fragile, without shame. She was not just a singer, she was a voice for those who did not know how to scream, those who carried nameless sadness, those who felt different, out of sync, those who had never found language for their own wounds. Dolores sang for them, not through perfection, but through honesty, not to soothe everything, but to say, "You are not alone." And then, the question planted at the very beginning of this journey returned, no longer as a question, but as a whisper that already held its answer. Why can a voice that heals millions be born from pain? Well, perhaps because only those who carry many wounds truly understand how deeply healing is needed. And perhaps that is why the music of Dolores O'Riordan remains, not to remind us of death, but to remind us that there are pains which, when sung aloud, do not disappear, but no longer have to be carried alone. After everything, what remains is not the noise of the stage, but a voice resonating within silence. Dolores O'Riordan has left this world, but her music has not. It is still there, weaving its way into the smallest moments. An evening when the music is turned on very softly, a long ride where no one speaks, an old memory that suddenly returns without warning. That voice was not perfect. It was not polished to please everyone. But it was honest. And that honesty is what allows it to outlive any trend. Dolores never tried to become a legend. She only tried to survive each stage of her life, through music. And perhaps that is the greatest legacy she left behind. A gentle reminder that fragility is not weakness, sadness is not failure, and sometimes raising one's voice, even when it trembles, is already an act of courage. That voice will continue to resonate, as long as there are people who need to be heard. If this story makes you look back at 1990s music with a different emotion, please press like to support the video. In your opinion, what makes Dolores O'Riordan's voice irreplaceable? Leave a comment. Icons and Legacies would love to hear your perspective. And if you love the stories behind musical icons, don't forget to follow Icons and Legacies as we continue this journey together. A voice may fall silent, but a legacy does not.